Chapter 1. Women and Education. I do not wish for women to have power over men, but over themselves. Mary Wollstonecraft, 1759 to 1797. Women's rights start with the education of girls and women. If we study the history of women's fight for equality with men, education has always been an important topic. It may be the most important topic, because women can only be equal to men if they have an equal education. But the fight for equal education has met many problems. In many countries, and at different times in history, girls had very little or no education. In the past, a lot of people believed that women were not as intelligent as men. People thought that a woman's only job was being a wife and mother. Why educate them for that? People worried that education was not good for women. In some places, people still have these ideas. The education of girls is still a very important topic around the world. In the 18th and 19th centuries, people started to think, write, and talk about women's education more and more. There was progress in some countries. In 18th century Russia, for example, Catherine the Great believed in education for everyone. In 1786, she started free education for all girls. In England, writers like Catherine Macaulay, Mary Wollstonecraft, Hester Chapone, and Hannah More all wrote about female education. At that time, girls from richer families only learned music, drawing, and maybe a little French and Italian. In her book, Letters on Education, 1790, Catherine Macaulay, the first English female historian, told mothers and fathers to educate their girls. Women could not do well, she said, because of their bad education. One of the most important people of this time was Mary Wollstonecraft. She was an English thinker and writer who wrote about education and social equality for women. Her books have been very important for women's rights, and they are still important today. Mary was born in London in 1759. Her family were not rich, but they educated her. She taught at a school and also worked as a private teacher. She taught children in someone's house. She then wrote Thoughts on the Education of Daughters in 1787. In 1788, she began working for a London book publisher who published her novel, Mary, a Fiction, 1788, and some of her other books. Her most famous book is A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, 1792. In it, she writes that men and women must have equal education. Boys and girls, she wrote, must go to school together. A vindication of the rights of woman is very important in the history of women's rights. Schools do not help girls and women, wrote Mary. With real education, she said, women could be good wives and mothers, but also good workers in many jobs. Her ideas were very new at the time. Other women wrote about better female education, but Mary's work was really important. She believed that education in Britain had to change. This kind of change could be good for all society. Mary was writing about women and the vote 100 years before women started fighting for it. Today, Mary Wollstonecraft is called the mother of British feminism. Any woman who has the vote and can read and write can say thank you to Mary Wollstonecraft. In 2011, a group of people wanted to get money for a statue of Mary in London, so they put a picture of her on the Houses of Parliament. We have a lot of statues of famous men. Let's have a statue of this famous woman, they said. In 2018, more people in politics and theatre joined the group to ask for a statue of Mary Wollstonecraft. The fight that Mary Wollstonecraft started in the late 18th century is still not finished. Since then, many women have fought for female education. Women like Margaret Bancroft and Jane Addams in the United States of America, USA, and Maria Montessori in Italy. In many places in the world, girls and women are still fighting for an equal education. One of the most famous fighters for girls' education today is Malala Yousafzai. Malala was born in 1997 in the Swat Valley in Pakistan. Her mother and father believed in education for girls. In 2007, a group of men called the Taliban came to the Swat Valley. They said, people cannot have a television or play music. In January 2008, the Taliban said, girls cannot go to school. Malala used the name Gul Makai and began writing for the BBC, the United Kingdom's television and radio, about life with the Taliban. She wrote about the last days before her school closed. Malala became famous, both in Pakistan and around the world, as a fighter for girls' education. She was brave, and she spoke about girls' education a lot. But the Taliban did not like it. On the 9th of October, 2012, a man from the Taliban got onto Malala's bus and shot Malala in the head and neck. 2 of her friends were also hurt. Malala did not die, but she was very badly hurt. She was taken to a hospital in the United Kingdom. People in Pakistan and around the world hoped that she could get better. When Malala got better, she decided to continue her fight for girls' education. In the next few years, Malala met with girls around the world, and she met with many politicians, like the President of the USA, Barack Obama. Everywhere she went, she talked about girls' education and equality. In December 2014, Malala Yousafzai won the Nobel Peace Prize. She was only 17 years old, and she was the youngest person ever to win it. Today, Malala and her father, Ziauddin, work in many countries. They want to help to give girls an education. Malala has said, I tell my story not because it is unique, but because it is not. It is the story of many girls. She is right. 130 million girls in the world do not go to school, and 15 million girls of primary school age will never go into a classroom. This is because of things like war, or because girls have to get married when they are very young. In some countries, children have to work to get money for their family. The education of girls is still an important problem for countries around the world. Educated women have better health and they work more, says the World Bank. They also do not have as many children, and they marry later. Countries where girls are educated are richer too. Spending money on girls' education is very important if each country wants to become richer and happier. As Malala has said, one child, one teacher, one book, one pen can change the world. Chapter 2. Women and Human Rights. What are human rights? Having human rights means that we are all equal in society. We are born with our human rights. They are the same for every person. Examples of human rights are the right to vote, the right to think and speak freely, and the right to free education. Human rights mean that people are not put into prison because they do not agree with the government, and that people are not hurt when they are in prison. It does not matter what gender or race you are, or how rich you are, you have the same rights. Human rights are a very important part of democracy. There have been many women who have fought for human rights in different countries. In the USA, a lot of black women have fought for freedom. One of the early fighters was Harriet Tubman, 1820 to 1913. Harriet was born a slave in Maryland. This means that she and her family were not free. When she was 12 years old, she was working in the fields. She could not read or write, but she was very intelligent. From a young age, Harriet knew that she wanted to be free. She also knew that she had to help other slaves to find freedom. At this time, there were slaves in the south of the USA, but not in the north. In 1849, Harriet ran away to find freedom in the north. But she did not stay there. She went back to the south and helped to free other slaves. First, she helped her family, and then she helped others. She was very brave. She often spoke about the freedom of the slaves and women's rights. She started schools for free slaves because she knew that education was important. Later, she also fought for the vote for women. Harriet Tubman led the way for another famous fighter for human rights, Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was born in Alabama in 1913. She is famous because she did not stand up. When Rosa was a young woman, in many places in the USA, black people, who were called coloreds at that time, and white people could not sit together. From a young age, Rosa knew that there was a black world and a white world, as she said later. One of the places where black people and white people did not mix was on buses. Rosa Parks worked at a shop in the city of Montgomery, Alabama. On the 1st of December, 1955, after a long day's work at the shop, Rosa Parks got on the bus to go home. She sat in a seat for colored people. In those days, there was a line on the floor of the bus. White people sat in the front of the line, and black people had to sit behind it. This meant that when a black person caught the bus, they had to get on at the front of the bus to pay. Then Then they had to get off and get on the bus again at the back door. On this day in December, the bus began to fill with white people. After a short time, the bus was full, and the driver noticed that some white people were standing up. The driver stopped the bus and asked 4 black people to stand up. This meant that the white people could sit down. 3 of the black people on Rosa's bus stood up, but Rosa did not. She continued sitting. The driver asked, "Why don't you stand up?" Rosa replied, "I don't think I should have to stand up." The driver called the police, and Rosa was arrested. What Rosa did on that bus was very important in the fight for black people's rights in the USA. Today, there are still many women fighting for human rights in different parts of the world. In Iran, there is Shirin Ebadi. Shirin was born in the city of Hamadan, Iran, in 1947. In 1969, she got a degree in law from the University of Tehran. She later got a PhD, a higher degree in law, and she became Iran's first woman judge. In 1975, she became the first president of the Tehran City Court. Later, Iran's government stopped women from becoming judges. Shirin lost her job as the president of the city court, and she had to work as a secretary. For years, Shirin Ebadi fought to work in law. In 1993, she was able to be a lawyer again. She helped many people in prison, and she stopped them from getting hurt by the prison workers. In 2003, Shirin was given the Nobel Peace Prize for her work in democracy and human rights, and for fighting for the rights of women and children. The Nobel Committee said she was a brave person who never worried that she was in danger. Now she travels around the world speaking about human rights. Rigoberta Menchú is also an important woman who fought for the rights of indigenous people in her country. Rigoberta was born in 1959 to a poor Quichimaya indigenous family in a small village in Guatemala. When she was young, she helped with the family's farm work. Sometimes she worked in the mountains where her family lived. Sometimes she went with other children and adults to pick coffee on big farms near the Pacific Sea. But she went to school, too. After leaving school, Rigoberta worked against human rights crimes by Guatemalan soldiers from 1960 to 1996, during a war in the country. In 1979 and 1980, her brother, Petrochinio, and her mother, Juana, were killed by Guatemalan soldiers. Her father, Vicente, died in the 1980 burning of the Spanish embassy. In 1984, her brother Victor was also killed by soldiers. In 1981, Rigoberta ran away from Guatemala because living there was dangerous for her. She went to live in Mexico. In 1995, she married Angel Canil, a Guatemalan. They have a son, Mash Nahuel Ja. While in Mexico, Rigoberta continued to fight for indigenous people's rights in Guatemala. In 1992, she got the Nobel Peace Prize for her work. Rigoberta and these other women have fought for the rights of women, but also for the rights of all humans. Chapter 3. Women and the Vote. If we win this hardest of all fights, then, in the future, it is going to be made easier for women all over the world to win their fight when their time comes. Emmeline Pankhurst, 1858 to 1928. The fight for the vote was one of the greatest fights that women have had. It started in the 19th century and continued into the 20th century. In the 1890s, parts of New Zealand and Australia were the first places to give women the vote. The first country in Europe to allow women to vote was Finland, which was then part of Russia. Finland also had the world's first women members of parliament, MPs, in 1907. After Finland came Norway, which gave the vote to women in 1913. Denmark followed in 1915. In the United Kingdom, the vote did not come until 1918. The fight for votes there was led by some very brave women. The most famous is a woman called Emmeline Pankhurst. She was the leader of the suffragettes, the name of a group of women who fought for the vote. Emmeline was born in 1858 in Manchester, in the north of England. Her father had a small business, and they lived in a large house. Both her mother and her father believed in women's rights. Emmeline was the oldest of 10 children. She was very intelligent and could read when she was 3 years old. In Emmeline's time, girls were not given a very good education. They learned things they needed for family life, like how to cook. But Emmeline's mother and father had money. When she was older, they paid for her to go to a women's school in Paris. When she came back 5 years later, at 20 years old, she could speak good French and knew how to cook. But she also knew chemistry. In 1879, Emmeline married a lawyer called Richard Pankhurst. Richard also believed in the vote for women. He wrote some laws in 1870 and 1882 that allowed women to keep their money or houses after they married. Emmeline and Richard had 5 children between 1880 and 1889. Emmeline and Richard believed in the same ideas. When he died in 1898, Emmeline was very sad. In 1889, Emmeline started the Women's Franchise League, which fought for married women to vote in elections. In 1903, she helped to start the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, which became famous. They believed in doing things, not only saying words. The WSPU were the first suffragettes. Emmeline's daughters, Christabel and Sylvia, were also suffragettes. In Britain, politicians, the newspapers, and the people were very surprised by what the suffragettes did. The women walked in the streets and broke windows. They burned buildings. When they were put in prison, they did not eat. In 1913, A suffragette called Emily Davison was killed when she threw herself under the King's horse at a famous horse race. She did this because the government would not give women the right to vote. The suffragette said, "Emily died for women." Emmeline was a very good speaker. She went to the USA and gave many talks there. The most famous one was called Freedom or Death. It was about how strong the suffragettes were. Emmeline talked about "We women of England." She said, "The men who are against us have to choose between giving us freedom or giving us death." Some people did not like what the suffragettes were doing, but Emmeline and the other women knew that they had to do something. They couldn't just talk about things. Emmeline, like many of the suffragettes, was put in prison many times. From 1908 to 1909, she was in prison 3 times. From 1912 to 1913, she was in prison 12 times. She was very brave, and she knew that women had to win this fight. She even stopped eating. Sometimes the police forced her to eat, which was very painful. Sometimes the suffragettes almost died from not eating, but still they continued to fight. At times, the suffragettes also chained themselves outside 10 Downing Street, where the British Prime Minister lives, shouting, "Votes for women!" There were also some men who fought for a woman's right to vote. 2 examples were Members of Parliament Keir Hardie and George Lansbury, who both agreed with the suffragettes. Winston Churchill, who later became Prime Minister, started his career against the vote for women. But later, he agreed with it. Maybe this was because his wife, Clementine, agreed with it. In 1918, women over 30 got the vote after many years of fighting. Emmeline died on the 14th of June, 1928, at the age of 69. On the 2nd of July, 1928, women were given equal voting rights with men. They could vote at the age of 21. Emmeline did not live to see it. In 1999, Time magazine called Emmeline Pankhurst one of the 100 most important people of the 20th century. They wrote that she changed society very much. What about today? In the 20th century, women in many countries fought for the vote and got it. Little by little, women have got the vote in almost every country in the world. Years that the vote was given to all women in a selection of countries. 1893, New Zealand. 1906, Finland. 1913, Norway. 1915, Denmark. 1917, Russia. 1918, Austria, Germany, Poland. 1919, Netherlands, Sweden. 1920, USA. 1922, Ireland. 1928, Britain. 1929, Ecuador. 1930, Turkey. 1931, Spain. 1944, France. 1945, Italy. 1947, Argentina. 1949, China. 1950, India. 1953, Mexico. 1954, Colombia. 1957, Malaysia, Zimbabwe. 1960, Canada. Some women were given the vote in 1918, but Asian and indigenous women were excluded from voting at that time. 1962, Algeria. 1962, Australia. Some women were given the vote in 1902, but indigenous women were excluded from voting until 1962. 1963, Iran, Morocco. 1964, Libya. 1971, Switzerland. 1974, Jordan. 1976, Portugal. 1989, Namibia. 1990, Samoa. 1993, Moldova. 1994, South Africa. From 1930, only white women were allowed to vote. 1994, Kazakhstan. 2005, Kuwait. 2006, United Arab Emirates. 2011, Saudi Arabia. Many countries gave the vote to some women earlier than the years shown here, but these dates show the years all women were given equal voting rights to men. Saudi Arabia is the newest country to give women the vote, in 2011. In 2015, women there voted for the first time in town and city elections. Hatun Al-Fassi was one of the first Saudi Arabian women to vote. The Saudi professor and women's rights leader was driven to the voting station because women were not allowed to drive in 2015. She voted in an almost empty building, which was for women only. "It feels great," she said as she came out, with a very big smile. "This is a very important moment. I thank God that I am living it." She fought for that day for more than 10 years. This was progress for Hatun Al-Fassi and for Saudi Arabian women, but still only 10% of Saudi's voters in the 2015 elections were women. In Saudi Arabia and some other countries, like Pakistan, it is difficult for women to go out to vote. But from June 2018, women in Saudi Arabia were allowed to drive themselves. This may mean that higher numbers of women will vote in the future. Women have made a lot of progress in the last 100 years. In most countries, they can now vote. This is thanks to brave women like Emmeline Pankhurst and Hatun Al-Fassi, who fought so hard and won. Chapter 4. Women and Feminism. When we use the word feminism, We are talking about a number of political and social movements and ideas that have one goal. That goal is to achieve equality between all people. All over the world, feminist movements have fought, and are still fighting, for women's right to vote. These movements are also fighting for women's right to work, to earn equal pay, and to own property. They are fighting for women to get an education, and for women to have equal rights when they get married. Feminists have also worked hard to stop sexual assault and other crimes against women at work and at home. Feminism is not new. It has a long history in the West and in other parts of the world. The history of modern feminism comes in 4 waves or movements. Each wave looked at different parts of the same problem. The first wave, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was mostly about women's right to vote. The second wave, which began in the 1960s, was about women's fight for freedom. During this time, women fought for equality in the law and in society. The third wave, which began in the 1990s, continues the work of second wave feminism. In it, women want to be themselves. They fight to be different from how some men want to see them, and from other women. The fourth wave started around 2012, and it is about sexual harassment and crimes against women at work. It uses a lot of social media, like Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, and has been led by the #MeToo movement. The first wave of feminism in the West was mostly about getting the vote. Women in Northern Europe, and in places like the United Kingdom, the USA, and Australia, were all fighting for the vote in the last years of the 1890s and the early years of the 20th century. But during these times, countries like China, Egypt, and Iran had feminist movements too. For example, the Iranian women's movement wanted to achieve women's equality in education, marriage, careers, and law. In Egypt, in 1923, Huda Sharawi started the Egyptian Feminist Union. She was the leader of the Arab women's rights movement. The second wave of feminism arrived in the middle of the 20th century. Second wave feminism was about more than the vote. It was about sexuality, family, and work. Second wave feminism also talked about sexual assault against women. It brought changes in laws about divorce and children. All over the world, feminists fought to change family laws that gave husbands control over their wives. In many European countries, married women still had very few rights. For example, in France, married women could not work if their husbands did not agree to it. That law only changed in 1965. One of the greatest European women at this time was a French philosopher, thinker, and writer called Simone de Beauvoir. Simone de Beauvoir was born in Paris in 1908. She studied philosophy at the Sorbonne, the famous university in Paris. De Beauvoir was only the 9th woman to study at the Sorbonne at the time. In 1929, when she was 21 years old, she met Jean-Paul Sartre, the philosopher. They were together for 51 years, until he died in 1980. They never lived together, never married, and never had children. She spent her life writing and thinking. Simone de Beauvoir wrote her most famous work, Le Deuxième Sexe, The Second Sex, in 1949. In it, she said, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." With this famous sentence, Simone was the first thinker to write about sex and gender. "We are born as a sex, either as a boy or girl," she said. "But our gender is made by our society. As we grow, society teaches us how to act like women." "Women," said Simone, "are always described as the other." She means that women do not act like men, and because of this, men believe that women are not as important as them. Simone wrote a large number of books. Her thoughts about women in society are still very important today. Later in the 20th century, writers like Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem from the USA and Germaine Greer from Australia continued Simone's work. In 1963, Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, was published. It showed that some American women were not happy if they only worked at home. They were not happy just cooking and looking after the children. People really liked the book, and Betty talked about it all over the world. 10 years after her book was published, more than half of the workers in the West were women. The world was changing fast. Countries in the West are not the only countries that have important feminist writers and thinkers. In the Arab world, Nawal al-Saadawi is very famous. Nawal is a doctor and writer from Egypt. She has written many books about women in Islam. In the 1980s, she spent a lot of time in prison because of her work. In her book, Memoirs from a Women's Prison, 1983, she wrote, "Danger has been a part of my life ever since I picked up a pen and wrote. Nothing is more perilous than truth in a world that lies." People have called her the Simone de Beauvoir of the Arab world. The third and fourth waves of feminism, from the 1990s until today, have often been about women's fight against sexual harassment and assault, and the fight to be themselves. Women's sexuality is important in these feminist waves. These waves are also about the sexism that happens to women every day. Fourth wave feminism uses social media to talk about the problem of harassment in the street and at work. It also talks about sexual assault in universities and colleges. Examples of fourth wave feminism are the 2017 Women's March, the 2018 Women's March, and the #MeToo movement. The #MeToo movement talks about famous men who have hurt or harassed women. Many men in the film and TV business have been accused of harassing women and of sexual assault. Today, Englishwoman Laura Bates is an important feminist. After studying English literature at the University of Cambridge, Laura looked after other people's children. She learned that the young girls she looked after were already worried about how their bodies looked. She set up the Everyday Sexism Project website in 2012 after finding it difficult to speak out about sexism. The project shows that sexism happens to women every day in many ways. Women from all over the world can write to the website about the things that happen to them. Today, some people say that women have won the fight for equality. But it's not true. Women all over the world are still fighting for their rights. Chapter 5. Women and Work. In the past, almost all women worked at home. They did cooking and cleaning, and they looked after children. In some places in the world, that still happens. When women started to do paid work in the 19th and early 20th centuries, almost half of it was cleaning and cooking in other people's homes. It was hard, dirty work, and there was not much free time. Women often lived in very small rooms. New jobs that appeared in factories, shops, and offices were better, but women earned half the money that was paid to men for the same jobs. They also worked long hours and got very low pay. And it was very hard work. During this time, women also became teachers or nurses. But people thought that this work was not important, and women had to leave their jobs when they married. War is usually a bad thing, but it has sometimes been good for women and work. In World War I, 1914 to 1918, men left home to fight, and women were needed to work both in the army and in their home country. World War II, 1939 to 1945, gave millions of jobs to women in the USA and in the United Kingdom. Thousands of American and British women joined the army. Although almost none of them carried a gun, they did men's jobs and got the same pay. At the same time, millions of men left their jobs to fight the war in Europe and other places. This meant that women had to go out to work because they needed to feed their children. After the war ended and the men came home, more than 2 million women lost their jobs. In the USA and the United Kingdom, women had to return home. Newspapers and magazines told women to keep a nice, clean home while their husbands were at work. They showed the home as a woman's place. There were still jobs for women, but they were usually in shops or for secretaries. However, the number of women working outside the home was still higher than before. This was because a lot of men did not come home from the war, so women had to work to look after their families. In the 1950s, many countries in the West became quite rich. Factories were making lots of new things, and this meant there were new jobs for women. In the 1950s and 1960s, the number of women who worked outside the home went up again.